Ahoy Captain, and welcome to this masterclass on marine fuel properties and cost. This masterclass will help you choose the right fuel for the future. It is a ship owner's guide to emissions, regulations and cost. Our goal for the next 45 minutes is to give you everything you need in order to make the right decisions and to know which direction the wind will blow in the coming years, in order to understand which fuels fit your needs best. We cover some of the technical properties, operations, but mostly the regulatory aspects, emissions and associated costs involved. This masterclass will consist of 4 different sections. First, we will discuss our methodology and which fuels we will consider. Secondly, we will discuss the properties and associated costs. We'll also show some parts of the associated guide and the tools you can use to make your own analysis. Then we will help you choose a fuel, but disclaimer up front, ahead of the disclaimers, that of course is almost impossible if we don't know your ship type and your needs. Suffice it to say, we'll give all the guidance that we can at the moment, and we'll end with a few frequently asked questions. As always, feel free to skip ahead to the fun parts or the parts that interest you most. Before we start, a few disclaimers from our part. This masterclass is comprehensive but not complete. I have some to extensive knowledge in general on most, if not all, of the fuels, except for a few which I will discuss, mostly through working with them myself, but I'm not a chief engineer. I haven't topped up the vessel that many times. And it's mostly through our work with especially suppliers and a few clients working on the regular fuels, associated fuels and biofuels, that we get our knowledge. There are also a few fuels that are not included at the moment. These are emulsion fuels. We will include them in the future. So rest assured, more will come your way. Also, it is mostly independent of ship type. We just have a look at the fuel, so it's a fuel-centric approach. At the end, we'll discuss ship types briefly, but we consider everything from the fuel perspective. And it is subject to some serious change. Prices always change. Some of the regulatory aspects do change from time to time. EU ETS, UA prices change all the time. So, well, what can we say? We just use quite some assumptions, but that's also the reason why we use our tools to get instant forecasts and also instant cost estimates in the next coming years for all the different fuels. And then finally, it is extra and not premium content, and by that we mean that we will show everything that we have. Mostly some things we cannot disclose because they are behind a paywall, which is the premium content. And of course, if you want that premium content, you can always sign up for premium features, downloads and supports. If you want anything that we show you in this masterclass, the guide, the tools, the databases behind them, the updates on prices, etc., all you need to do is sign up and it is yours. But first, let's dive into part 1. This section is all about how we define fuels. There are plenty of frameworks which we will discuss, at least the most important ones. But in the past 10 years, I've come across quite a few. And the ones that we use mostly relate to costs, regulatory costs from emissions. So we will explain mostly the basics. It's useful for those who are not too experienced with the topic, and also those who want to know how we made our methodology. Of course, you can also read it in the guide, but if, like me, you're a visual person, then of course it's also nice to hear or see it from a first-person perspective. But, you know, let's just start. The absolute basics. What do we use in the marine industry or on board a vessel? Well, if you Google or just, AI it, then you will see pictures like these. All kinds of fuels, all kinds of ships, HFO, NDO, MGO, LNG, biofuels, methanol, hydrogen, all kinds of stuff. This is a lot of text, and yes, it is all being used, some more than others, however. This is one that's maybe a little bit easier. Typically, we have, you could say, heavy fuel oil that is used most. I'll show you why in a few slides. But heavy fuel oil is basically the bottom of the barrel. It's cheap, and for ship owners that's good, and it has a high energy content. So traditionally, fuel oil or heavy fuel oil has always been used. Marine gas oil is a lot lighter oil. It's not a gas, or at least not a gas under normal atmospheric pressure. It's simply a gas oil like gasoline, and it's mostly used for auxiliary engines or for four-stroke engines, not the two-stroke propulsion engines in a diesel, electric or generator setup. Not always, but typically. It's a bit easier to work with fuel as opposed to heavy fuel oil. LNG is also used more and more. That is a gas, liquefied natural LNG, liquefied natural gas, probably AI. I just also took a few pictures from the internet. But LNG is a much lighter gas. It's mostly a methane. It's a lot cleaner, except for, of course, methane slip, which we will discuss briefly. But it's a gas, and it requires a lot more, you could say, operational. It's more of a high maintenance girlfriend as opposed to heavy fuel oil, which just gets the job done. And then we have biofuels, which is also being used more and more. Actually, because of the Renewable Energy Directive in the EU, it must be used more and more. And that is a whole variety of different mixed biofuels, mostly biodiesel, FAME, fatty acid methyl ester. It's a pretty classic biofuel. There's no such thing, I guess. After 10 years, I still learn new things every day when it comes to biofuels. It's quite something. But there are different kinds of biofuels that we will see. I think these four, you could say LFO, light fuel oil, marine diesel oil, those are also used, but these are pretty basic brackets, and these four, what we will see later, families of fuels are actually used most. I think these would cover over 90% of all fuels used in the marine industry. And also note that LFO, residuals and marine diesel oil, I also put those here in the marine gas oil and the heavy fuel oil buckets. So this is another one. There you see VLSFO, but another one, pros and cons. Have a look at it. What you see in all of these comparisons, and why I wanted to show it, is that the basis is always HFO, heavy fuel oil. And how does it look like? Well, here you go, from left to right. It's the reason why it's called heavy, it's show that later, but it's typically also the basis. You go from left to right, heavier to lighter oil, emulsifiers that's used mixing and emulsion fuels. HFO, then MDO, you can see those are typically blackish. They have, when they're from fossil derived sources, they have a lot of stuff in them. Things like sulfur, especially heavy fuel oil, could have a lot of sulfur, pretty high sulfur content, but also nitrogen, sometimes even radioactive materials when it's still in crude form. So it can be nasty stuff. You don't really want to be working with it too much. Then we get gasoline, diesel, and then MGO, marine gas oil, which is already becoming lighter, and then B, that's typically biodiesel at different blends. And well, not just blending them, all of them, you can't really necessarily blend them, but what we see is that if an engine is built or used, they have specific fuel requirements that they need. More on that also in a few slides, but every engine has a preference for fuel setting, also chiefs. There is some mixing and matching, so there are some biofuels you can use as drop-in fuels in the others, because they have very similar chemical properties, all work the same, but not always. So that's where most of the difference come from. So we keep saying heavy fuel oil, it's black. Why is it used? Where does it come from? There are a few things I learned over the course of a few years that really opened my eyes. So where do fossil fuels come from? Dinosaurs, of course. So they're pumped from somewhere below, and then they're put into something like this, a distiller, where the crude oils are distilled into different streams. So the lighter it is, the higher it is distilled. So all the lighter residuals and very light gases, they are easiest to distill, and they go all the way up. And the very heavy stuff, like actually all the way down to the things that remain solid, the road and asphalt, solid to a certain degree, but almost, that's why we say the bottom of the barrel. That's literally what it is. This residue, this bitumen, and after that the heavy gas oil, those are actually sometimes quite toxic residuals. That's why they call them residuals, that you can put in ships because you can't really use them anywhere else. Otherwise, these previously known as oil majors or now energy majors, yeah, you're basically left with a residue that you cannot really sell, or you have to maybe pay for it to have it chemically removed. So this really nasty stuff, actually nasty in terms of working with it, emissions, a lot of things, but at the same time very energy dense in terms of volume, and that's why it's perfect for ship owners. Plus it's very cheap. It's almost, well, they need to sell it to someone somewhere, and well, ships like it, so that's where a match is made in heaven. So most ships use, especially long voyages, two-stroke, slow diesel or similar type engines, they use heavy gas, residuals, marine oil. Then we get things like diesel, kerosene, marine gas oil, that's close in that range, marine diesel oil as well, but marine diesel oil, as we'll see, is a bit of a mix of residuals and distillates, and marine gas oil is a lot purer and has less contaminants, and then all the way up to LPG, etc. and even LNG, but typically that's not really part of the crude oil mix. So these are the different streams, and if you have a real look at how does it look like in real life, well, this is heavy fuel oil. You can see it's quite viscous. Actually, there are different types of crude oil that you have to heat up, because otherwise it just solidifies under normal conditions. And actually my wife, she was working at a shipyard at a time when we first met. She had a ship that had a hole, like a hole in the hull, so there was just at some point crudes coming out. Luckily it was in a dry dock, and the chief forgot to turn off a valve, so everything flowed out of the vessel into the dry dock. And there it just became more or less fixed, like, well, road and asphalt. So they had to have a special crew come in and take all the residue out. It can be quite nasty stuff, but then again, it has a high energy content. And ultimately in the industry, it's, well, also about making money. And that's also one of the primary reasons why we have the problems that we have. Not that they can't be solved technically, as we'll see, but, well, we have to make a profitable business in the long run. It needs to be sustainable from an economics perspective, and that's also the reason why we use this stuff. Anyway, without becoming too philosophical, this is more the what's being used and the associated problems, and that's why people say we need to cut down on our fuel emissions, ergo we need to reduce fuels consumption, especially the heavy fuel oil. That's why things like EU and other, well, IMO currently not too much, but they still impose quite a few regulations on the use of fuels. So there are a few existing frameworks, and even a lot of them which we will not cover because they don't affect your bottom line. But FuelEU, EU ETS, to some extent IMO with the upcoming IMO Net-Zero Framework. We'll see how that will work or not. And of course, technical standardization ISO also comes into play. These frameworks more or less define what you can use or how it should be operationally, what the safety limits, etc. are, health, safety and environment, and of course what we will pay. The problem is they all do it differently. They have different ways of explaining what fuel is and how to penalize that. So we have 5 different regulations, documents, etc. ISO 8217, that's more or less the technical framework for these kinds of fuels. Then we have EU ETS, which is basically a carbon tax, FuelEU Maritime, which is a carbon intensity penalty, IMO Net-Zero, kind of like FuelEU, but currently it's unknown when it will come into effect. But these all, well, EU ETS, FuelEU and IMO Net-Zero, they have a direct cost effect on fuel use, and they drive for the most part your fuel cost. And then we also have the Renewable Energy Directive, which is also coming in play and also imposing more and more, and indirectly also imposes fuel costs. So we might extend the list in the future. We will actually, when more's coming online. Everything that affects the fuel, not the fuel price, but the fuel costs, that we will include in our modeling. For now, EU ETS, FuelEU, and to a lesser extent IMO Net-Zero are the most important frameworks, especially EU ETS and FuelEU. Those we use the most. IMO still under debate, but that said, they all do it differently. They have different ways of calculating costs, penalizing, but also even within the EU ETS framework and the FuelEU framework, they have different ways of calculating emissions, and that can cost you millions if you use the wrong number. So let's make a comparison between the three. These determine the costs, as I said, the scope itself, EU, of course, EU, voyages, IMO, that's global or outside the 12-mile perimeter, economic zones. The boundaries, so what we mean with tank to wake, it's simply we look only at the combustion of the fuel, so everything that we combust, everything before the regulation doesn't care. Well to wake means the entire supply chain is taken into account. If we have a very clean combustible fuel with almost no greenhouse gases, but very high greenhouse gas footprint to make it, then we are still penalized. So EU ETS penalizes absolute CO2 equivalent numbers. That's why it's easiest to work with, and both FuelEU and IMO have a greenhouse gas intensity per megajoule, so that's CO2 equivalent per megajoule. The mechanism is allowances, so 1 metric ton. For every 1 metric ton in the EU ETS system, you need to provide one allowance, so that's why it's called a carbon tax. And FuelEU and IMO, they basically say that if you are above a certain threshold, that's when you start paying a certain amount per ton of CO2 equivalent emitted. It comes into force. Well, it's already in force. EU ETS has had a few phase-ins, and then the prices are expected to rise. FuelEU, also there, it has every 5 year a more stringent target, so there also costs will increase. IMO, not known. And here are the references to the different regulations. I might show them later, or I'll at least highlight in the references where you can find them to have a look. I don't recommend reading them. It's a pain. It's really a pain to understand all of these. It's part of what we do, what we must do to make your life easier, and it does help to understand the whole system and see where the opportunities are, but damn, these are tricky, complicated, and no fun at all. All right. What is fun is our framework of using the marine fuel. So we basically took these three as our basis, and of course, as you'll see, ISO, because that determines the operational limits and boundaries. And we basically said, okay, if we put them all together, which different fuels do we need to define in order to make sense of our business cases? If we do calculations, which ones can we compare within the different frameworks? We came up with 22 different marine fuels, 3 groups and 6 families. Let me explain. So on the first column, fuel, these are all the fuels that we have defined, and there are actually already subclasses coming up, or a better definition of some of the fuels, especially HFO and LFO, because they also include higher and lower sulfur variants, as we will see. And also blends are, well, in some tools we include them, biofuel blends with different ones, but those are blends, so 2 other fuels. Anyway, there are 3 main groups that every single regulatory framework uses. Fossil group, there's the biofuels group, and there is the e-fuels group, as we call them. So e-fuel stands for electricity. It's the use of electricity and some feedstock to make a synthetic fuel. And IMO calls them ZNZ, zero to near zero fuels. EU calls them RFMBOs, or sometimes I believe RB something else as well. EU ETS uses something else, but RFMBO stands for renewable fuels of non-biological origin. So we have fossil, we have biofuels, and we have synthetic rests, and we call them e-fuels. And then we have families, 6 little families. They all look alike. What do we mean with families? We mean residuals, distillates, LNG, hydrogen, ammonia, and methanol. These are the 6 families. Basically saying that a fossil hydrogen and a biofuel hydrogen and an e-fuel hydrogen from an engine perspective should be, the specs are followed, exactly the same. So if we have LNG, bio-LNG or e-LNG, the engine shouldn't care, it's all LNG. So when we're talking operations, technical sides, specs, etc., we typically talk family. And when we talk regulations, costs, OPEX, emissions, we typically talk groups. So that's why we made this distinction. And this is also typically what we will use what you will see and what we use in the tools and what we will update in the future when regulations but also fuels are updated. Now let's have a look at a few of the most important ones. What you'll notice is that some of them, like let's see, LPG, ethanol, LPG and DME, we don't give them a family per se, but that's because they are so unused or described to such little detail that basically for us giving advice, well, wouldn't be helpful. So these are the ones that we have sufficient enough knowledge on through our suppliers as well, and that we can all describe in terms of OPEX and operation. So let's have a look at the most important fuel. So the fossil fuels, the most used fossil fuels in the marine industry. HFO, LFO, MGO and MDO. And these are described in most detail in ISO 8217. So these are all the different classes and mixes, etc. And here you can also see that MGO and MDO, they have some overlap and people use them a lot in the wrong places, I guess, or they just intermix them. But what you can see is that MDO is the heavier variant, MGO is the lighter, true distillate variant, and the MDO sometimes even has residuals mixed in them. In terms of lighter and heavier fuel oils, that mostly has to do with the viscosity. The heavier the fuel oil, the heavier it becomes, all the way up to RMK being the heaviest fuel oil. And the letters and the explanations are also in the guide, but they describe the flow properties, viscosity properties, the grade application, and whether or not it's for special purposes like cold weather, etc. So these are all the ranges of the fossil fuels, and what we see in the different regulatory frameworks is that, except for IMO, LFO, HFO, MDO and MGO, they're all lumped together. There's no distinction whatsoever if you use the cleanest MDO or the dirtiest MGO. If it's classified as an MGO, it's MGO with associated emissions and penalties. Another aspect that we have to take into account is the amount of sulfur inside the fuel. Especially heavy fuel oils can have a high sulfur content, which is not allowed, especially not closer to ports, etc. So there are ultra low all the way up to very high sulfur fuels. Is below 0.10% sulfur content. Very low is between 0.10 and 0.50, and high sulfur is above 0.50. And for those types of fuels, they are inside national waters. So there are limits to the maximum amount of sulfur in the fuels. We typically do not distinguish in our tools the amount of sulfur used, because from a compliance perspective, regulatory perspective, it doesn't matter. It could impact the base cost of your fuel. So your fuel price itself could be impacted. Then we have a few other fossil fuels, namely LNG, LPG, hydrogen, ammonia and methanol. Ammonia, not NH3 is ammonia, so I've just written it as NH3 so it fits better. What do we have? HFO, MGO, biofuels. They're all nice little fuels, as in liquid fuels, biofuels, they're pretty big group. But typically, if we're talking biodiesel or HVO, HFO, MGO, LFO, you can all just bunker them, put them in your pipes. You don't need double wall piping, all the things that you need for the other types of fuels for which you do need a lot of extra stuff. LNG is a gas, so you need to have it compressed or typically very cooled. Same applies to LPG, ammonia as well, hydrogen, not shown here, but also a gas, so you either need to compress this or liquefy it to a very high degree. Methanol, not so much. It is a liquid under ambient pressures, but it is a low flash point fuel, so you do need to make some precautions like double walled piping, etc. So everything on the right hand side can be more complicated to work with because it's gas. Everything on the left hand side, well, that's easier to work with because it's a liquid. It's not having typically is having an easier flash point. How this relates to bio and E, I'll tell it in a few slides. One thing we have to mention about LNG. LNG has something called methane slip. What is that? Here we have a combustion chamber, gas as in LNG, and air go in and something comes out. When it fully combusts, we only have CO2 and H2O, but it doesn't combust fully. There's still a little bit of non-combusted LNG or methane, CH4, getting out of the chamber. And methane has 28 to roughly, in some cases, 100 times higher greenhouse gas potential as opposed to CO2. So the methane molecules are actually holding on to a lot more heat and contributing to the greenhouse effect a lot more than carbon dioxide. And that's what's called methane slip. There are three ways of getting methane slip and why it occurs. There's all the kinds of crevices typically in these types of chambers. Valve overlap, nothing works perfectly, so there's still gas coming in and directly going out. And then wall quench, different temperatures at the wall itself when it's not too hot, especially in the beginning, but in certain load regimes, there you can have a higher degree of methane slip. So plenty of ways of having methane slip, also plenty of ways to reduce it. Suffice it to say, it is there and something to be alert of, because you get penalized a lot, and we will see that. Typical C-slip for engines is shown here. This is what regulatory bodies take into account. If you have something else or you want to prove that you have lower methane slip, you have to do so. Then about biofuels and e-fuels. What are they when comparing to fossil fuel? Well, here is a nice little selection from Finco Energies, formerly Good Fuels. There you see FAME, fatty acid methyl ester, also called biodiesel. I'm still not sure why they sort of use the two together. Eucome means used cooking oil, something. So these are all just different kinds of fuels. You see heavy fuel oil, we see MD, so marine diesel, probably plastic to fuel. There we have an e-fuel, plastic made to fuel, MGO fossil, DMA, all kinds of stuff. Two things you need to know about biofuels and e-fuel. One is if they are chemically the same, the engine won't notice, it won't matter. So if you have a synthetic MDO or a synthetic MGO, or for that matter a synthetic heavy fuel oil, your engine should be running smoothly. There are a few things, of course, to consider. Secondly, it needs at least, in the marine industry, a 70% reduction with respect to a fixed value of 94 in order to count as a biofuel or an e-fuel. So technically, e-fuels and biofuels are identical to their fossil counterparts, but they differ in feedstock production and emissions. And if you look up the finer details, the small print in the Renewable Energy Directive, you see that we are allowed a maximum greenhouse gas intensity of 28.2, which is very important in the calculation. And all these regulatory bodies, they use this differently, but they all use the Renewable Energy EU ETS and FuelEU, they all use the Renewable Energy Directive, so that's why we keep going back to them. And this somewhat similar is used by IMO as well, at least a 70% reduction, but they have a slightly different threshold, I think. I have to look exactly. All nice and dandy, let's go to some sort of an overview. Here we go. This is, I believe, Shell. It looks like Shell, but also something I found online. But it is a very good overview if you're talking about what is the difference or, similarities between fossil, bio and synthetic. Fossil feedstock is gas, fossil, dinosaurs. But you can see that we have the groups as columns and then we have the families as row. Methanol, biomethanol, e-methanol, engine doesn't care. Operationally it's the same chemical values, but it's just a matter of feedstock differences. And of course for all the e-fuels we need electricity, renewable electricity. And 2050, all synthetic, I don't know, this looks like something made for a politician. It's not that simple, also not that easy whether or not it's gonna go there, but the Germans did it in the Second World War. They started making e-fuels out of necessity, so it's not something new. These same processes are still being used today. It's all a matter of cost effectiveness. One of the reasons why FuelEU and EU ETS are also made by these regulatory bodies is that they price fossil differently than synthetic. So synthetic becomes more cost effective. That's the whole name of the game. Anyway, fossil, bio, synthetic, same families, same behavior. That's very important to note. And the only thing that's different is the OPEX cost associated to it. And it's Also good to know that if you now double down on methanol, ammonia or hydrogen for whatever reason, you can always use the bio or the E component along the way and you don't have to change anything on your vessel. That's good news. So we're getting close to the end, the beginning of the end, not the end of the beginning. In short, the problem is threefold. First, all frameworks disagree. That's actually how we started with this 1 year long process of making a fuel properties and cost guide. Problem number one was, dude, which emission factors do I need to make this calculation? It took us a long while to find out. They are all different, they're all diverging, they are constantly changing, as we will see, but this is a very big problem. Secondly, man oh man, is it vague or not? Yes, extremely. Compliance, especially FuelEU and IMO Net-Zero, if it ever comes online, I don't know, maybe not. Maybe it's better if it doesn't come online because it's going to save us a lot of headache. It is very vague, and making new business cases based on these types of regulations is highly complex. That's why we are here, of course, to simplify it, but still, it's a lot of work, even for us. And these calculations, as you will see, complex is actually not the right word. It's complicated. It is still linear. You can put something in and you will know, and you know what comes out. But there are some complexities in the application of different decarbonization measures, and there are certain non-linearities inherent to the modeling that can make it very opaque. This is not something an ordinary ship owner does, or in my opinion will do on its own, unless it, well, we see from our clients that the amount of associated administration and work is extreme. So it's not a lot of fun. You just want to focus on sailing. So that's why we are here. We're here to try and make sense from the nonsense. So we have this masterclass where we will explain all the concepts. There is the guide that we will show that helps you to go deeper. Everything there is explained. You will see more of it, and we actually do a lot deeper dives into the different topics, and of course you have all data in the guide itself, and the actual calculations, tools, changing of assumptions, all those kind of things, those are in the calculators, the databases, and our tools, and you can use them to make a fuel-centered approximations of fuel cost towards the future. I gotta say, it's a pretty long introduction, but you know me, when I do these masterclasses, I don't want to hold back. Now you know the basics, really, and let's dive into the second part where we will discuss really the fuel properties and the prices. So it's taken us about a year to do it properly, but why? We started with just simply what's the price, and then we realized we need a lot of knowledge on the properties and the emission factors and the frameworks in order to truly determine the price, and they are interlinked, and that's why it took us so long to get a real good answer to the question, what does or will my fuel cost? I can guarantee you we can't just give you one single answer. As always, there's always plenty of answers, but we do have ways of making it a lot easier. So fuel properties and prices, if we have a look at what really is a fuel cost, the total cost of burning or actually using fuel, it's the fuel price plus the compliance cost. So the total cost that we define in dollars is the fuel price per metric ton typically, because that's how we in the regulations calculate, plus EU ETS costs, plus FuelEU penalty, minus a surplus if you have it from FuelEU due to pooling, plus IMO penalty if you want to. This is how we currently calculate fuel costs, and you can add different layers of OPEX, and we will in the future for different regulations, but this is what we will discuss. Before we do so, we need to have a look at EU ETS, FuelEU and IMO and how this is calculated in effect. As I said plenty of times, all these three frameworks, they use different ways of calculating. EU ETS is the easiest one. That's simply mass multiplied with an emission factor. FuelEU is trickier. It's a greenhouse gas intensity. So they take the whole supply chain, the whole shebang. They add methane slip, different engines, electricity consumed, reward factors, LCV, blah, blah, blah. This is why it's a bit of a mess. Have a look at the regulation, Appendix 2, and there you will see the original formula. It's no fun at all. And then we have IMO Net-Zero. It is easier and it's mostly the same, but it's energy used divided, sorry, not energy used divided by, it is total equivalent carbon footprint divided by the energy used on board, but then for the whole supply chain, and it has different tiers. So These, as you see, not only have different ways of calculating, my dear people, they also have different LCV values, different ways of verification, even ETS and FuelEU, they use different emission factors from time to time, so it's pretty tricky. It is pretty tricky. But before we can calculate costs and go to prices, there's a few things we need to know, which is the properties, LCV values for the most part, and emission factors second. So let's have a look at the operational properties for these 22 marine fuels. Here you see the table that we use currently. From this table, LCV values for us is most important, and in some cases density, of course. If we want to work with LNG or hydrogen or other gases, we want to work with density. Of course, there we have the issue that different atmospheric pressures and temperatures will lead to different densities, but we'll cover that later. In gray are all the low flashpoint fuels. So these fuels typically need special safety measures. Typically that includes double-walled pipings, fire safety measures, all those kind of things. Sometimes specialized tanks, pressure tanks, ABC, different levels depending on cryogenicity. Anyway, gray fuels mean a bit more work. Not too bad per se, can be good in some cases, but they more work. That's why biodiesel and HVO, as if possible drop-in fuels, are typically more desired from a ship perspective. Operational, then emission factors. As we saw, let's start with EU ETS, because they simply take the mass of a fuel that is burned and they multiply them with the emission factors that you see here, these columns. They change over time and probably will in the future. All the values, all the cells here in gray indicate those that have not been defined by the regulation, for which we assume specific values that you can read up upon in the guide itself. But this is, for all frameworks, the framework that we use. We have the 22 fuels, the fuel class, so the group, and then we have all the LCV values and all the different emission factors. Plus, not just engine types, there's a little bit more behind it. C-slip as well in order to calculate the equivalent emissions. But this is what it is. The fun begins when you realize that FuelEU has their own values, which coincide for the most part, but the way how they deal with it because of the well-to-tank aspects and the E values of the fuels is different. So EU ETS uses a 0 CO2 factor for biofuels. FuelEU does something else. They reduce the E value, that's the certificate. That's the E value on the certificate of the biofuel. They reduce it by taking the part that's burned and take it from the tank to wake part. As you can see, that's why you have those negative numbers. It's a bit of a mess, but we do see that 28.2 coming back here, because here you see that we have literally set this is the maximum, or the maximum that particular fuel can be, so that's what we're going to use. And it also will show later up the prices, but there more about that later. IMO, a lot less is known about IMO. That's why there are more gray areas, literally. So that's also one of the reasons why IMO costs are a lot higher than what we see right now. But also these data sheets are continuously being updated. And that's all we need in order to calculate the real fuel prices. But yeah, it depends. Let's start with just, simple ordinary fuel prices. Since we started recording fuel prices, we've seen a period with high degree of stability, not too much happening, a few peaks here and there. And then all of a sudden, somewhere around this year, March, when the Strait of Hormuz was blocked by some incident, we see a lot of spikes. So yeah, we see a difference between 0 and 2000. Some fuels or things or whatever, there's a high degree of variability. So this we can never be certain. This also, we track it. Right now we update it automatically in our tools, but you can have different agreements in place with suppliers, so we can never know for sure what the fuel price is. The regulatory aspects, costs associated with these fuels, those we can calculate now that we have LCV values and a way to calculate. So those are easier. How do we do it? We take, as you saw, fuel price plus the different compliance costs, and let's take LFO as an example, because LFO in FuelEU, but also ETS and a lot of frameworks, is typically used as sort of the base fuel for the marine industry. So what do we see? Boy oh boy, this is a lot. Let's just start with the timeline. We go from 2026 to 2050 on the x-axis, and we have costs per VLSFO equivalent ton. In this case, let's just call it per ton of fuel. But if we compare apples and apples, we want to take the same amount of energy when we are comparing the amount of fuels. So we basically normalize for 1 metric ton of LFO, typically in all our calculations. And here you can see the compounding costs of fuel. We kept fuel constant because, well, we got to start somewhere. So we're keeping it constant. It's actually a lot higher now than before we started making these nice graphs. Then we have EU ETS, which is expected to rise by about 7% per year. FuelEU, that's having these nice little bumps every 5 little years. And IMO, mostly the same, but it has not been defined or enacted yet. And it's also not defined after 2030 or 40. So we just sort of assume it's more or less the same after that. And luckily on our models, you can click it off. But what does this mean? That for LFO in the coming years, not too much. EU ETS typically put on the invoice to the charterer or not. If you do have to pay for it, you can already see that if you pay for your own fuel, you have to pay EU ETS. Yeah, that's already a significant part of your fuel bill. Now, the rest, I mean, if we don't have IMO and we're looking at FuelEU costs until 2035, it's pretty okay. But after 2035 and beyond, it's getting roughly the same price as LFO nowadays, and afterwards it's more. So that's what we call the tipping point. Typically we say if you have a ship that has end of life before 2035, don't do too much. At least not in engine refits, etc. If you're designing a ship now, it still needs to sail after 2035, you're going to have some issues. You're going to probably have at least a refit if the ship is still sailing after 2045. Because then, well, let's have a look. 2045, compliance cost almost 5 to 6 times the cost of fuel prices. So then, fuel price, who cares? It's all about compliance. So that's the tipping point. End of life before 2035. That's good. We did this for all different fuels, different base fuel prices, etc. So we basically calculated fuel price that we have currently plus compliance cost for all fuels. And you can do this at home because we have all the tools available for you. So these are all these nice little squiggly lines. As you can see, for some, FuelEU is really accounted for. And what is important here to look at. A lot of biofuels and e-fuels, they are basically flat for a very long time until 2050, because in our models at 28.2, only from 2050 onwards will they incur a penalty. But if they have a lower E-value on the certificates, or the E-values are actually lower than 18 point something, then they will never really incur any compliance cost with the current set of regulations. So there you go back to the 2035 part, where after 2035 a lot of the fossil variants are more expensive than the bio and the e-fuel variants. Of course, prices will then catch up, blah blah. But this gives you a bit of the dynamic that's going on here. And also gives you one of the reasons why we cannot give a singular price, because it changes everywhere, it changes your assumptions. So there's a lot of stuff going on. But bottom line, again, the 2035 fossil fuels after 2035 increase heavily in terms of compliance cost. And there's one thing that wasn't included here, because it is really, how shall I say, it can be the biggest friend currently for ship owners who have it, but you don't have it. It's you need to have such a friend, and it's not easy to get. But it's FuelEU surplus. So FuelEU works by setting a target. If you're below the target, you create surplus. If you're above the target, you need to pay. And you can actually pool ships together and then redistribute that surplus, and that's how you can make money. And that can be big, I can assure you. Actually, if we look at FuelEU surplus, and I believe this is until 2035, it is huge. It can be up to, with the current prices that we have of about $200 euros per metric ton of CO2 equivalent, then we have for one VLSFO equivalent stock, for example bio LNG, extremely high amount of surplus that we can redistribute to other ships and make money on. Forget about the IMO for now, that's a bit tricky, but what we see, if you go to the green stuff, that's good, but it's hard to include. I'll show that later in the calculators. So FuelEU pooling, if you have it, you can make business models, especially for let's see, ammonia, methanol to a lesser degree, a lot of biofuels and e-fuels, of course, LNG. This is one of the reasons why LNG currently is also being, or a lot of LNG ships are being made at the moment, because they do well with FuelEU. So end of life, before 2035 is good. Let's have a look at that particular tipping point and have a look at the assumptions that we have. So at the top you see the compliance cost before 2035, accumulated compliance cost, and then afterwards you see beyond 2035 also the average. So of course they're skewed towards 2050, then they're a lot higher. But if you compare these, of course, to the fuel cost, and mind you, these are FuelEU equivalent prices, per energetic prices, we see actually that, of course, beyond 2035, regulatory prices are expected to skyrocket, literally. Even if we don't have IMO Net-Zero, these prices are well beyond what you pay currently for a metric ton of fuel. So it is quite something. This tipping point is typically what I have in mind when a ship owner asks me what they need to do, which fuel they need to use towards the future. The first question that I ask is, until when do you need your ship? So I think that's enough for the passiveness. Let's have a look at the interactive model. Forecast yourself and do the awesome stuff. Let me get the premium version for you. And here we have the fuel cost calculator. Well, it's actually a special version that we are building. It's currently only available for members, and it has all of the fuels that we want in there. So we cannot really pick and choose. We can actually, make certain kinds of selectors, etc. But what we can do is we can click and choose what we want to include in our analysis. So sometimes it's slow because it needs to recalculate everything, but suffice to say, it is really cool that we can make our own analysis for the long-term future, the short-term future, etc. I already see that we want to change one thing from 2026 until 2035. 2005, yeah, there we go. And this is pre-tipping point. We're not going to do fuel prices for the moment. No, like this. This is clean. This is neat. We're going to first have a look at surplus. Mind you, this is all 100% EU. FuelEU equivalent cost or total cost, it doesn't really matter. Everything is calculated in equivalent cost. The total cost are just every year compounded. EU ETS 75 is actually a bit more, but well, it's 85 as a start. Boom. And then of course we can do indexing later. So this is it. So until 2035, yeah, my advice, which will also be shown later, is don't do too much. No, prepare. Do nothing is, I'm gonna say it later, do nothing, but that's just so you'll remember it. But you don't typically have to do anything weird unless you have a lot of money available, you're willing, plus you have certain insights or already know which kind of fuel that you want. For example, for chemical tankers it can be easier, or if you're shipping ammonia, well, then it could be done more readily as opposed to a more regular feeder, container feeder. Anyways, drifting off here. So we're gonna keep it like this. Let's see, include FuelEU penalty. Yeah, not right now. Fuel price. Yeah, no, this is good. So the first thing you'll notice is that, yeah, except for hydrogen, even all fuels have very low EU ETS, and that's because since this year, I believe, the CO2 equivalent values are taken into account. So N2O included. We'll discuss methane slip later. First, a surplus. If you include surplus, you get a totally different game. Then some fuels are way more attractive than other fuels, and this is why it's so hard to make a single comparison. So if you're not including surplus in your business cases, then HVO is attractive to a certain extent. But if you do include it, HVO and biodiesel, well, they're clear winners. And bio-LNG, again, that's why LNG is such a clear candidate for the very long term, because you can use LNG now and still get a lot of surplus value. You can use bio-LNG when it becomes available. You might even going to use e-LNG when it becomes available. Then we want to have a look at the trends and forecast. And here we see that actually pooling or surplus, that's gonna, let's put it here, UTS as well. Pooling, yeah, that's gonna remain $200. Is it $200? Okay, so $200 actually, not euros. Okay, we'll have to see. But what if we have a small indexation of about 4% per year? Then you can see that almost double. So we get a lot more bang for our buck over the coming years. The same applies to EU ETS. We typically use a 7% increase as per most of the forecasts. Let's see, ETS, yeah. Most forecasts seem to make the statement that we have a high degree of increase for EU ETS. And let's see afterwards. Can we do it? Oh yeah, hell we can. So you can actually see it jumping after 2042, more tightening, and that's when you really get very high EU ETS cost, up to $500 euros per metric ton. But let's just put it back here. So this is how we used the modeling. Fuel input, so here you can see some of the consumption. This is what we mean with VLSFO equivalent. So for some fuels we need more in order to get the same amount of energy, and you need to be, well, certain that you get the same amount of energy. So we compare on an energetic basis, recalculate metric tons of fuel, and from that we calculate the associated cost. Fuel properties, so we have the IMO Net-Zero, the FuelEU and the EU ETS different tables, as you can see here. These you can change, and we change them automatically when it becomes available. And we also see a very important one here, biofuels E, so that's the E value, the total well to wake footprint of the biofuel. And if we use 18 as an input, then we get a very different comparison. Whereas when we, for example, use 12, that's basically the lowest. Let's see. Yeah, so then it gets really low, and then biofuels score even better. But if we get a shitty biofuel of about 26, and right now, as you can see, we've just done them all, we've lumped them all together, then it's a different story. Others become more attractive. Well, at least in this case, it doesn't matter much. But if we go tipping point and beyond, let's see. Okay, well, still, oh yeah, we're gonna have some small amount of FuelEU, but still, okay, it's quite robust to this particular scenario. And if you have surplus, yeah, okay, then the things change. Sure, makes sense. At least the things we don't want to use, those are listed here. Those are actually what one might expect. One more thing you can do is here see these costs per year if you want for all the different fuels, so you can see the different trends. But this is also pretty interesting. We can have a look at where not just the tipping points, but if for example we want to have a comparison. We only had a look at these. Yeah, so here we can basically calculate what fuel price needs to be in order to be at the similar level as other fuels. So let's see, fuel prices. Well, no, we don't want to do that. Biodiesel 1200, HVO 1400. Could be. Okay, so if we not use FuelEU surplus, okay, yeah, this is nice, because here we see that with the current assumptions we actually have similar costs using biodiesel as well. It's actually using biodiesel is cheaper than using MDO if we include these costs and not even include surplus. So we can actually compute the price level of a fuel with respects to others, with respects to different types of regularizations. How cool is that? Yeah, that's why, yeah, it's awesome stuff. It really helps us to have a view on, okay, what prices should be, how much you need to blend, what's best for your vessel, etc, etc. It's awesome stuff. And have I mentioned that you can use this as well? It's really cool. Just go to the website, go to our tools, look up the fuel cost calculator, and it's yours. You noticed me getting a bit enthusiastic. Well, that is what I do when I work with these kinds of things. Turning it back now, this is going to be pretty short because we need more information before we can give true advice. But there are some things apart from the tipping point. No, well, the tipping point is most important, but there are a few more things that we can show you. But again, bottom line, what suits your ship is dependent on one question mostly: end of life. So if we take all the way to 2050, then we see that if we take FuelEU as a baseline and the amount of costs involved for most of the fossil fuels, then we see this typical ramp up. This is how we think. Different ways of thinking about those time frames. Before 2030, do nothing. I don't know. Should I say that? I'm not sure. It's not doing nothing at all. You still need to prepare for biofuels mostly, but to be honest, most of my clients, I mean, I make money with doing something. So if I say do nothing, and with nothing I mean no major refits, etc. yet, unless you have insiders information or like Maersk, a lot of money to make your own supply chains, yeah, then it's very smart to make the early move. But for most ship owners, doing nothing is a smart move. And then do the minimum, at least blending of biofuels. That's definitely needed, not just because of cost perspective, but also because you need that experience towards the future. Then, if your ship's still around afterwards, you need to either do or prep for a refit. Always you will be electrifying in every port. By then you will have to use onshore power supply for almost all ship types. So a dual fuel engine you will almost to a high degree of certainty need. But if you have electrification on board, dual fuel engine, and the ability to do biofuels, at least experience and you know which one to use and your OEM is fine with it, then you can always make that decision at the latest possible point. After 2045, you probably need a whole new design, but who cares? That's so long away that we'll talk about it later. All right, so choosing a fuel. Let's have a look from a fuel operational perspective, because this is one thing that most people like me tend to overlook, forget, or not take into account. Cost is fine, cost is perfect, cost is basically the basis for which we determine stuff. But what's also very important is volume. You can't really take with you what you don't have. A ship has a certain confined space. So a volumetric comparison of fuels that we almost have standardized in our decarbonizer, which I'm proud of, is something that we do as well. What we see here is that if we take HFO and LFO as sort of a normalized base case, so 100%, and suppose your tank currently on your ship is or you use HFO and LFO, a little bit of MGO, on board, then you see that if you switch to LNG, you need almost twice as much pure in terms of volume, and that exclude installation costs of the tank. Biodiesel, HVO, you need quite a little bit extra, 100% biodiesel fame. But if we look at methanol, ammonia, and even hydrogen in its liquid form, its ultimate form, excluding the insulation factor, methanol here also excludes the insulation factor, we need 2 to 3 times more space on board for the same amount of autonomy, for the same amount of energy. So that's why alternative fuels and hards, and that's why, going back to the beginning, that's why heavy fuel oils are great for ship owners, because these are the most energy dense fossil fuels that we have, and they are cheap. That's good. And this is also what's making it hard. And this is also why methanol, in terms of the alternative fuels, is typically a ship owner's first choice, because it's liquid at an ambient pressure. And if you look at the amount of actual energy, so what I did here is I calculated the amount of energy that we have in LFO, the same amount of energy in methanol, same amount of energy in liquid ammonia, same amount of energy in liquid hydrogen. But you see that we have a lot less volume available, or actually, because we need more of the fuel, we need to shrink either the amount of energy that we can carry on board. For methanol, that's the least of all these different fuels. So that's why methanol for a lot of ship owners is a good option from a fuel perspective. Then again, it still has carbon emissions. You must have a bio variant or an E variant, which is hard. So that's why some say ammonia is easier, because there you don't have those emissions, but that also brings with it different operational aspects. This is from a ship owner's perspective. Let's have a look at the ship type perspective, and for that I'm going to get me the fuel properties and cost guide. So here we have the fuel properties and cost guides, and this is scroll through, most of it already have seen here. And in, let's see, chapter 4, if I'm not mistaken, we have a chapter on what to use for your ship. So we have a fuel comparison, a lot more into detail than what we just now discussed, but we also have a ship comparator, which is here. It's in fine print, because I can probably make another masterclass on it, and best thing you can do is use our decarbonizer in order to get a good estimate. As in, mostly it's not about the ship type. There are some ship types for which I can say specific things. Chemical tankers, ammonia carriers, CO2 carriers. I mean, there are specific ship types doing specific things for which switching fuel is easier. Switch to whatever you carry, etc. For a lot of offshore vessels, or vessels with a high peak demands but lower energy needs, like tugs, etc., electrification is a very good option. For container ships that have the option or don't typically sail further than 1 or 2 days per leg or whatever, then maybe having a long range doesn't matter as much, so you have a lot more options, and even a higher degree of electrification can be used, especially if you can swap batteries. For very large crude carriers, etc., well, there's a different story. Then maybe carbon capture and storage could be a better option, because, well, if you're shipping crudes halfway across the world, then you're not going to do it on pretty much any fuel is going to be a challenge. So there are things to say per ship type. We have explained what we can here, but best you can do is go use the decarbonizer in order to get a result that fits your ship. And we're actually upgrading it, so what you will get probably when you see this video, something like this. All the different kinds of decarbonization measures and also types of fuel changes you can do with your current baseline and the effect on your total life cycle costs plus the estimated effect on your day rate. So we basically calculate all the way through until your end of life, and then depending on what you have, you can pick and choose and see what is most cost effective for you. And here we see, for example, methanol slightly more expensive than hydrogen fuel cell. And if you dive in the model, I know for a fact that the autonomy or the size of the tank for methanol is so much more than the size of the tank for hydrogen, and that's where you get a cost difference. You can actually tweak with the assumptions, tank assumptions, cost assumptions, different kinds of fuel assumptions in order to really get something that fits your ship, in combination with other measures, because having wind assisted propulsion or a different hull coating that will reduce your energy needs, make it easier for other things, etc. So use the decarbonizer when it comes to choosing a fuel for your ship. Everything that we have discussed is already included in these calculations, so you don't have to worry about all those complicated regulations and calculations. We do it for you. Now the last part, where we will be brief, the frequently asked questions. We've answered most of them already. We'll also hint slightly towards the references that you can access in the guide itself and download. And of course, besides all the tools, what you can use for your own modeling and analysis. We have 6 questions, if I'm not mistaken, 7, which have been asked a lot, many times through our help desk clients and partners. And we're just going to start from top to bottom and show you how we answer. So why can't you just give me a price? Well, that's of course how we started this whole 1-year process. It's because depends on what your price of fuel assumptions are, what your ship needs to comply to, etc., etc., and also how you think that the world will be in a certain amount of time, if you want to include or exclude certain costs, if you want to include or exclude certain ETS regimes. For example, we haven't mentioned UK ETS. That can be the case for you, blah blah blah. So we can give you a price if you either use the tool or let us know what your ship and specifics are. What is the best fuel? Also there it depends. People say there's no silver bullet. I typically say there are a lot of silver bullets. You just have to pick yours. My go-to fuel option still is, without knowing your specific ship type, it's always the least amount of biofuels needed, especially if your ship is sailing around after the tipping point. You will need them. They're easiest, especially if you drop in biofuel. Everything else, methanol, ammonia, hydrogen, will require quite substantial refit typically. So that's why I would not recommend that per se. After 35, it depends on your supply chain and where you are sailing. But what is the best fuel? Best in terms of most cost effective, depending on the fuel price that you can get at the moment. I would say some biofuels. I have seen deals for even very cheap hydrogen, biomethanol, bio-LNG. LNG is also pretty good with that in that regard, but I've also seen some matters about methane slip being raised, which gives it to me some amount of risk. So best fuel, hard to say. If I put my hands in the fire, I would say biodiesel at the moment, to a limited extent. That's probably going to change next week when I have more information. What will EU ETS do in the future? We'll have a look at one of our stories that we made on this. It will rise with about 7% per annum is the expected average of all the forecasts that you have seen. I personally expect it to go way through the roof, way higher than that. It's going to hit 1,000 before 2040, but we'll see. It's going to at least increase, and we take a nominal increase, a pretty conservative increase of 7% per year. Which fuel has the least exposure? Well, if you count electricity, next question, as a fuel than electricity, but no. Which fuel has the least exposure? Anything, any biofuel or e-fuel below 18.5 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule from the top of my head has the least, because they will not or almost not be affected by either FuelEU, EU ETS, or in the future IMO. All those fuels. Basically, avoid any fossil fuels, and then the least exposure, that depends on your certificates. And this is also why LNG, if you can manage methane slip, is a pretty good option, because that you can You don't need a drop-in new kind of biofuel. You just either pick bio-LNG or EV-LNG in the future and exposure gone. What about electricity? Yeah, what about it? I wanted to include it, but it's so different, and it's gonna get a different separate masterclass on its own. We chose to not include electricity in the mix here because it's not a fuel, it's not combusted. Most of the time also outside of the scope for most ship owners and regulations. It is typically a high capex game, but if you can get your own electricity per kilowatt hour, it is by far the most cost effective and least risk option for most ships that can do it technically and economically. So as you hear, a bit biased towards an electrical solution, always, except for those long hauls, large seagoing vessels, large fossil tankers, etc. There it doesn't really make sense, no matter how big a fan I am. So what's the difference between MDO and MGO? Have a look at our guide at the frequently asked questions section. There we have a very nice table. MDO is marine diesel oil. It's actually not really diesel, it's heavier. And MGO is marine gas oil, more akin to actual diesel on land, weirdly enough. And MGO is distilled, it's clean, it's nice, it's crisp, it's for more particular engines. And MDO is a bit heavier, could still have residuals, and it doesn't always have the lower sulfur content that MGO has. And how did you get this data, and how do I get it? Well, let's have a look at the guide and see where we get all our information from. Here we have the guide, and on the left hand side we have all the references. Have a look. Members can download it. Key regulations located at the top, and then all these other guides we have used for not just operational information, prices, etc., for basically anything. And if you have a look here, you can click on it. For example, the FuelEU regulation. So this is basically the regulation. Set have formula Annex 2, and here you can see how we calculated everything in terms of, let's see where the formula is. Yeah, the table that you saw that we mentioned with the dark blue on top. This is a lot. Yeah, so these are where the calculations come from. That's all located here. So members can download this, can download everything. Have that little light reading, put it on your desktop, on your nightstand, what have you. So it's all included here, and that's where we get all our information from. And that concludes our masterclass. Is there more to say? Probably. Will we say more? This is the end. No, but do you need more? All you need to do is sign up to the help for those premium features, downloads, and excellent, awesome support by us and the entire crew. I'd love to hear more from you. Let us know what you need in order to make your business case. Thanks for watching this video, and have a great day.